So let's start off with this question, of course. Why Teal? Has anyone come across that term before? Can we just see if people are familiar with it? A few people. Who's completely unfamiliar with it as a term in organizational development? Okay. Okay. So it's good that I'm going to go through it briefly about why Teal. The word comes from this book, Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux, which over the last, I don't know when it was published, maybe 3 years ago or something like that, it's had a lot of interest in the organizational transformation world and therefore by default in the agile world as well. What he talks about in that is a way, he basically interviews 12 different organizations who are working in unusual ways, ways that are not traditional. So exploring things like, you know, more autonomy for the employees, different ways of setting salaries and stuff like that. So lots of different kinds of explorations in there. And from all his research, he came up with this model. And this model represents what he calls a level of organizational consciousness, if you like. And at the very bottom, he color codes these and he gives them metaphors. So the very bottom one is red, and he uses the metaphor of wolf pack there, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it's basically the idea of that organization is it sort of thrives in chaos. And examples he gives of red organizations are things like the mafia, when you've got some very powerful person in charge basically telling everyone else what to do and killing them if they don't do it. That's the kind of organization he's looking at there. The army organization is sort of self-explanatory. It's how armed forces tend to be run or were run, perhaps more so in the past. And also the church, the Catholic Church, the Church of England are categorized under that. They're characterized by very strict hierarchies and where people know their place and they don't step out of line at all. So that's that second level of consciousness. The third level, he terms it orange. It doesn't look very orange in there, but it's orange. And he terms it, uses the metaphor of machine. And these are essentially the kinds of organizations that most of us spend our time in. They're driven, in a sense, I mean, they're scientific organizations, and so we use the idea of invention and lots of research and lots of new stuff, new ideas coming out. But the way they run tend to be also, you know, they've inherited the hierarchy from the level below. And it doesn't necessarily fit that well, and people are struggling with trying to out different ideas because they think it's the only way to do things, to have a CEO at the top and some high-level executives and some medium-level executives and some directors and some managers and then all the workers at the bottom. Very old-fashioned kind of Tayloristic approach to work. When you're working in the knowledge industry, as most of us are, all of us are probably, it doesn't quite work that well enough for that. But there's some good things that are happening there as well. But there's a culture in these organizations of what I would call individualism. It's very much about hero culture. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So the next two levels he identifies, and these are the companies he's interested in. Organizations that are run more like families. And the examples he gives are Southwest Airlines, Ben & Jerry's. Anyone remember what the other ones are? There's a few. Zappos, of course, Menlo Innovations. These organizations have a much more sort of friendly family feel to them, where people are treated a little better, a little kinder. And so he's looking at those organizations and moving up into the next level, where he says there's very, very few organizations there. And so his book is to find those, his quest was to find those organizations, and he calls them Teal organizations. And the metaphor he uses there is living organism, where the organization itself is essentially alive and finds its own pathway. And people are, again, treated even better perhaps than they are in the family level. Much more autonomy, much more say in the processes, much more decision-making power. So that's really the levels that he's looking at. When I first tweeted this, someone took issue with this term. It was an animal lover woman that I sort of vaguely know. And she was absolutely right, because she said wolf packs do not behave that way. Wolf packs in captivity behave that way. This whole idea of an alpha wolf controlling other wolves is apparently observed only in captivity, and the person who did that research has since said I was wrong. Wolves are actually much more here. So wolf pack is not a very good metaphor. Sadly, it's encoded in the book and never will be changed probably, but I'm going to change it to that. I'm changing it to monarchy. Because monarchy precedes all these armies and machines and churches and stuff like that. It goes way, way back, where you've essentially got someone with an incredible amount of power who can basically make people, think of the Pharaoh in Egypt, someone who can make people do pretty much exactly what they want and kill them if they don't. So that's the sort of a bottom level here. So what's interesting about this, he's not the first person to sort of identify these things, he's just used different names. And this can map to, have anyone's read this book, Dave Logan, Tribal Leadership? Okay, so if you look at he comes up also with 5 levels of leadership, or ways of being inside organizations. And he uses sort of, he explains these in a lot more detail, obviously, but they can be sort of summed up in these terms. The bottom level is that life sucks. So you imagine if you're in a monarchy and you're not the king, life sucks. That's pretty much what it is. You're a serf of some kind, or a servant, or a worker. And then when you're moving up to the next level, the army church level, it's my life sucks. So there's a sense that there is a better life possible, but you don't have it. And the third level, I'm great, you suck. This is what I meant when I said a culture of individualism and hero worship. So people are striving to be better than everyone else. There's internal competition, and we see this playing out in a lot of organizations with our annual review and reward systems, for example, where teamwork breaks down as the end of year comes to pass, and people have to be impressing their manager as individuals, not as a team. So I'm great, you suck. Moving up to the family level, we get we're great. So there's a sense of oneness now, a sense of us. And the top level that he identifies is very similar to Laloux's ideas. Life is great. So it's not just about me, it's not just about my company, it's about life is great. So Teal companies, not only will they treat their own employees well, they'll treat everyone well. They'll treat their competitors well. They'll treat their customers well. They share ideas. Some of these companies go out and deliberately share the ideas they're using to be successful and profitable with their outright competitors. And they're completely open and willing to do that. So they're not holding back. They're not feeling, there's no sense of competition there. So the idea is that we can all achieve this if we want to. So there's a lot of similarities between those books, and that book probably came out about 10 or 15 years ago, I think. I'm never quite sure of publication dates, but it's older. So this work has been done in this area for quite some time now. Dave Logan doesn't use those colours, of course. That is Laloux's colouring, and it comes from somewhere else I'll talk about in a minute. So if you recast this into the styles of leadership that we tend to see in organisations, and this is my adaptation of this, that's the sort of leadership you see in the monarchy level, threatening leadership. In the army and the church, it's a commanding leadership. In our organisations, it tends to be a controlling leadership. Managers in charge taking the brunt of the responsibility and doling out work as appropriate. So there's a lot of control that people hold on to in those kind of mechanical organisations. Because machines need controlling, and when you see your organisation as a machine, the natural inclination is to say, how can I control this machine? What mechanisms, what procedures, what processes can I put in place to stay in control of people and what's happening here? And then the next level is, might describe that as paternalistic, which is not really a complimentary word, but the family dynamic in some of those organizations does play out that way. They tend to be male-dominated organizations, and there's a sense of like, I'm the benevolent father who's giving gifts and kindness to his children. But if you step out of line, there's consequences. There's a little bit of an edge of that in there. But when we go up to here, the management style is release. Let go of control, let go of command. Inspire people with vision, inspire them with a sense of duty and citizenship and responsibility, and let them figure it out. So that's the style of leadership at the Teal level. Now, I'm just going to, so at this point, I'm taking a slight diversion from my theme here, which is Teal fitting into the Agile world or vice versa. And just to go back a little bit and talk about where some of this stuff comes from and offer you another take on it. Spiral dynamics. Has anyone come across spiral dynamics? A few of you. It's been around a while, spiral dynamics, and it's an investigation. It came out of Maslow's work, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And some people working with him thought felt, I think Claire Graves was significant in this, felt that it wasn't quite right. It didn't quite fit what was really occurring in the world. So he invented this model called spiral dynamics. Again, it's about, perhaps more about individuals than organizations, but it's about what he calls a raising of consciousness. And it's about strengthening each level of your consciousness before you can move up to the next one. So if something happens, just like in the Maslow hierarchy, if something happens at a higher level, your next level down is stable and secure, so you won't kind of crash to the bottom. And so they identify, the very bottom is the beige one, the instinctive. It's sort of like caveman living, if you like, just kind of going with what is at the moment, surviving. Then you move up to the tribal level, where there's a bit more organization between human beings. It's not just everyone for himself. There's now group culture. The red is becoming the authoritarian, so that's very similar. So Laloux based his model on this and sort of like chopped out some bits of it and just kind of like squished them down. Red is authoritarian, just the same. Blue is absolutist. So it's sort of a belief that everything is as it's supposed to be. It's starting to go towards the sort of scientific mindset. This is the way the world works. It's actually like this. Nothing can be changed. Orange is materialistic. So we've got a materialistic idea here where people are very concerned about ownership of things. And so this is our culture essentially now, isn't it? We like to accumulate. We like to buy. We've got a consumer culture. Moving up from that, you go into more humanistic, and we see groups like Friends of the Earth and organizations like that who are saying there's something more than just consuming. There's something about giving back as well. So don't just take. And so the whole recycling movement is part of that level of consciousness as well. Anything to do with kind of like recognizing that we're not just human beings who live on this planet for our own gain. We're human beings who live on this planet and would like the planet to survive too for the future. And then moving up to yellow, which is integrative, and that's one that Laloux sort of leaves off. But I think it's sort of integrating many of these different ideas and trying to look at sort of a holistic view of the world and a holistic view of self. So when people get into meditation or mindfulness, they're trying to integrate themselves into the world a little more. And then at the very top, you've got this holistic. There's actually one level above this, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it just doesn't show on all of the, when you look up spiral dynamics, a lot of them leave it off because it doesn't exist essentially. But there's an expectation based on what we have so far that this will come to be, this will come to pass. So the very top is turquoise holistic, and for some reason Laloux decided to call that teal rather than turquoise, and I don't know why, but they're pretty much, if you look at the two colours side by side, they're pretty much the same, and they don't translate into Czech apparently. Oh, turquoise does. Okay, well there you go. You go with turquoise. Holistic worldview, again, very similar to Laloux. So that's the spiral dynamics. So I want to take Laloux's diagram and I want to take something else from spiral dynamics and put it below the monarchy thing, but in the same way that spiral dynamics has the tribal culture as being, you know, somewhat less than. It's a smaller group thing. There can be leaders, but they're not leaders in the same way that kings were leaders. And they're very driven by, you know, spiritual, magical, animistic ways of working and thinking. Very driven by the idea of gods came out of tribes. There was no concept of God before there were people working in groups together. And what's interesting, I've just been reading about this actually, so I'll throw that in, is the natural size for a human group is apparently about 150 people. It's like an extended family group. So tribes of about 150 people. And this was calculated based on brain size. So someone actually did research where they're looking at the brain size of different animals and the size of the packs. And from that calculated that, you know, humans should have about 150 people. And apparently this plays out. If people look in their phone books or, you know, think about the people they know, it tends to be, research actually was done on people's telephone books, how many names and addresses they had in there, and it tends to be around 150. So that's our small group. The problem is that when you've got about 150 people, they're usually kin or very close kin, cousins and second cousins and stuff like that. So there's altruism that plays into that. You know, Darwinism says it's about the survival of the fittest individual, but the individual cannot survive outside the tribe. They will be killed. So it's really important for us to group together as animals. And yeah, where was I going with that? I don't know where I was going with that. somewhere interesting. So the group size is around 150 for people. And the reason that religion was created by tribal societies is because the tribes got bigger and they needed something more to hold them together than just natural selection and instinct. So when you get 500, 1,000 people, when you start to build cities, there's no reason that people should care about or support one another. There's nothing natural in our makeup to say that we should do that, because we can only deal with this 150 people. So what was created was religion, which essentially is a set of rules to live by, a set of guides for people to live by. So that grew out of this. That's why we use the word spiritual at that level. So back on track. So if you add that to it, and you look at where we're going with this living organism idea and transcendence of that, in fact, which we'll look at in a moment, maybe this is not just a stack of hierarchy. And by the way, this is completely my stuff that I'm looking at here. It's not Laloux and it's not spiral dynamics. But it occurred to me after I gave this presentation one time, someone came up to me and challenged me on this stuff. And I said, well, it's not my stuff, but tell me what you think. And she said, well, maybe it's not linear. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So maybe it's, when we get up to this level, or perhaps the one above, which I'll talk about later, it might look a bit more like that. Maybe it's a kind of iteration or drawing of what was in our past in order to take it to the future. So it might not just be that, in a sense, it's quite arrogant to say that we today are far more sophisticated and conscious than people at this level. It's quite arrogant, isn't it? Because there's so much we don't know about how cultures lived in the past. And the more we do know, the more we recognize that we actually want some of what they had. So maybe there's some drawing around of something there. So, and this is really going off track from Laloux's stuff. But I think for me it was interesting, just from my own personal understanding. So it may suggest this. It may suggest not just an upward stepping thing or an upward spiral. It might suggest some descent. So if we look at the going from tribe to monarchy, is that an improvement? Is that an improvement of consciousness? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. So when you move into the church and the army, then of course there was fantastic work done and buildings, massive cathedrals and things and temples built in that time. So there was a lot of raising of consciousness in that sense. But if you look at the way people were treated, it's very, very different, and it's really brutal. It got more and more brutal. So maybe this is a descent. And where we are now is there in machine. Most of us are working in machine-type organizations, orange organizations. So the descent upwards now that we're trying to strive for is through family, explorer, using the spiral dynamics colors to living organism. And then this thing at the top, which is in the spiral dynamics book, but it's not, generally not detailed. It's living spirit. It's ascendance, if you like, something much bigger than just our bodies and our person and our relationships. It's something greater than that. And I think that maps back to tribal. It maps back to the spirituality and the magical thinking, perhaps, in a positive way. I don't mean that in a negative way. Of being in touch. If you look at Native Americans, they're very in touch with the earth, very in touch with animals and the spirits of animals. They named themselves for spirits of things, trees and plants and animals and things. So there was very much a sense of spirit going on there, and we're striving back for that. So it might suggest that it's more of a descent and a rise. And another way of looking at it could be in theological terms. I study theology, so of course I pull that in. You might look at that in 3 different levels as being heaven, earth, and hell. Now, you didn't know you were working in hell, did you, when you were working in orange organizations with individualistic cultures and hero worship and stuff, where we're driven by a consumer need to just own stuff. But the levels that he's identified, particularly this one and spiral dynamics of that one, are looking at rising above that and seeking something more, hopefully taking us back to the living spirit. So that might be another way of looking at it. And that's my detour. So now I'm getting back to the presentation. And you can do what you want with that. You can ignore it or challenge me, and I'm happy for both. And so this is back to Laloux's model with the renaming of the red level. So if we take those away, we're just looking at that. We're looking at Teal. That's what we're looking at today. We're not striving to be an army organization. We're not striving to be a monarchy in our cultures. We're striving for perhaps family-oriented organizations first, kind, maybe benevolent and inspiring organizations. But if we go up to the next level, which is Teal, which he says this is where organizations need to strive for better business and for humanity, essentially. So he identifies in the book three important elements that make up a Teal organization. And it's important to say that the 12 organizations he looked at don't necessarily do all of these things. Some of them just do one of them, but they do it really well. And others do, other parts of it. And parts of these also spill over into the green level, the family level as well. So these are not unfamiliar terms to anyone in the Agile space, of course. Self-management, I would prefer the term self-organization, but I think he means it in the same way. Wholeness, or wholeness at work, being your whole self. And evolutionary purpose, which is a really unusual one. I think only one or two of the organizations he talked to had that, where purpose isn't set and doesn't stay set, it changes over time. Now, there are organizations whose purpose changes over time. Amazon is an example of that. Apple is an example of that. So this is going on, it's happening, it's just perhaps not being identified because some of the other practices maybe aren't there. So these are the things apparently to strive for. So in a sense, Teal, for many Agilists who've read this book, has become this promised land, something to strive for. And so Agile wants to live here. It knows it belongs here, but it can't get in. So if you think about Agile transformations that we talk about, and you probably heard some examples of that today. In fact, we heard one if you were in Thomas's session. Agile tends to be something that executives buy to fix their development and their IT departments. It's very rare to be able to penetrate all levels of an organization and really get people thinking in Agile ways, actually treating people in Agile, what I call Agile ways, with, removing things like individual rewards and creating team rewards, or perhaps no rewards and just paying people properly from the beginning, as Dan Pink says in his motivation TED talk. Get money off the table from the start. So Agile wants to be there, but it's really struggling to get in. And so what's preventing it? And I think there are a couple of things. Perhaps I am, perhaps me, and perhaps you. Now, I don't mean this in an accusatory way, even though you've got a very big finger pointing. It's also pointing at me. So what is it our responsibility? It is our responsibility. And how are we failing? I think part of our failure is this. Our minds haven't got around this yet. We're still, most of us who work in mechanical organizations are still thinking in mechanistic ways. We're thinking in deconstructive ways. How do you understand something? You break it down into component parts, and that helps you to understand it. So I'll use, Portia's not here, but it's all right. I'm going to use an example from this morning, talking about hope. So the thing I struggled with that, I loved her presentation, by the way, I always enjoy her stuff. The thing I struggle with the concept of breaking hope down, sort of deconstructing hope into these component parts, is I feel that there's an essence of things that gets lost when we do that. But it's our scientific mind that wants to do that. If we break things down into their smallest components, we can understand them better, then we can build it up again. But in the breaking down and building up, you lose the glory, I think. And so we're still thinking in this sort of mechanistic mindset. We want to be able to say in our organizations, if this, then that. We strive for that. We want to be able to make predictions. So if we do this, this will occur. But when you're working in a creative organization, and building software is creative, and it's also very unknown. Software developers are like a bunch of improvisers. Pretty much don't know what they're doing until they do it, and they build on each other's ideas. These are the good ones, by the way. These are the good software developers. So what we're trying to get people to say is, instead of if this, then that, we want them to ask a question and then to experiment. So we say, if this, then what? If this, then what? And that's a totally different mindset. And it's not that. So that's one reason. And the other is just about the language. So what language do we use? We're bringing in language from the orange paradigm and perhaps the green paradigm to try and explain to people the Teal paradigm. Or let's call it the Agile paradigm, the paradigm that we're striving for, a different way of thinking and working. And we're using language. In order to help people understand, we've got to come back down and use language that they understand. But we get stuck there. We get stuck in the old language. So here's an example of, look what happened to Agile. This is a sort of, you can imagine this is sort of the early days of Agile. A bunch of people on a whiteboard, drawing pictures about what are we trying to do, you know, what do we care about, what do we value, and coming up with, you know, a diagram that is about as simple as that. And then perhaps erasing it the next day and coming up with something better. So it's a continuous process of improvement, right? That's why we have that in the Agile Manifesto. It's not encoded. But look what happened. We start to see things like that now. We go into organizations. Thomas, you touched on this too, so we got to nail it down. You know, we got to get everyone doing the same because we fixed it in this part of the organization. Everyone's got to do exactly the same. So we encode it. We tell people exactly what they have to do to be agile, which is a contradiction in terms, of course. We know that. It's a contradiction in terms of the word agility, but people think that agile doesn't mean agility anymore. It means something else. So what happened to agile? That happened. And of course, you know, it gets bigger. I don't say it gets worse. It gets bigger. So I think in our striving to get from here to here, we're getting caught in a loop. Sorry, not from here. So we're going through this machine thing from our old controlling mindset. And what's happening is that we get so far with our agile transformation, and then we talked about this, Elaine, didn't we, in our break? Someone at the top of the organization leaves who's been a champion, and suddenly they find that people didn't really want to do this anyway. You know, they say, oh, he's gone now, we can go back to doing what we did before. That was good, that was fine, you know, we knew where we stood, we knew what our role was. We don't know what our role is in this agile world. So he goes back again, and then maybe it struggles for a while, and then another CEO or CTO comes in who helps you. We've got to do this stuff. It does actually really work. And so you strive on for a bit. Then something else happens. Some crisis occurs. And people say, well, we're not going to do Agile for a while because it's not, you know, we've got to get this stuff out the door. We've got to fix these bugs. We've got to keep these customers happy. And so there you go back down again. And so it goes. And so that's we're stuck in this loop, I think, in our Agile transformations, so many of them. That's not to say that some are not successful. Apparently they are. I don't have first-hand experience to share. So, the language of Orange is very grid-like. We use spreadsheets, we use tables, you know, so people can kind of trace lines along and go, oh yeah, if that, then that. And funnily enough, Laloux actually uses that kind of language in his book, in diagrams like this. So there's a bit of irony there, in fact. This is a very common orange diagram showing things as, you know, the onion skins or these nested circles. There's a blogger called Think Purpose who works in some, no one knows who he is, and he works inside some giant kind of government building, and he writes about the nightmare of working there, but he won't leave because he loves writing about the nightmare. But he talks all the time about the consultants who come in. He said they always have either circles or triangles or a square divided into four. So that's the consultant's tool. That's the way they talk, and they present these models, and they go, this or this or this or this, and that moves up to here, you know, the kind of thing, and stuff like that. And that's, again, that's someone putting spiral dynamics into a language of the orange paradigm. The language of green is slightly different. The language of green tends to be more values focused. People are looking not so much, you know, let's get these models nailed down and follow these patterns. It's about what do we care about. So we're starting to now to talk about some value stuff. You know, what do we care about? The problem with it is who is caring about that stuff? And again, if it comes top down, you're being told by someone, oh, we're going to have an email free. I heard this conversation in the hallway. We're going to have an email free Friday. No one's allowed to look at email. It's not like, would you like to have an email free Friday or not look at emails? Everyone's going to do that, and therefore we're going to talk more. And so now people can't look at their email. They can't get on with what they need to do. So it doesn't really work that well. Or you're told to have fun at work. Can you imagine? You must have fun at work. But if the environment isn't there to have fun at work, you won't have fun.
I had it at my company when we were introduced, like, every Friday afternoon we need to play together. And it was, seriously, it was forced. And for the first 2 months it was ridiculous because the team, one team was enjoying it because they didn't have that much work. But we had a lot and developers had a lot. Yeah. And we were like, that's ridiculous. And then we were being forced. And after a couple of months we started to like it, but it shouldn't be like forced, it should be
Yeah.
collaboration.
Yeah, you're right. And I heard a story similar to that where a company made everyone take a compulsory day off in order to come on a company retreat to play together and do teamwork. They didn't pay them for that day. They made them take it out of their holidays. So this is what happens perhaps when you get top-down directives about having fun and whatever else is on there. They're not bad things, but any statement of values needs to rise from the bottom. It can't be directed from the top because it just becomes another way of complying to a system, and it will cause resistance. And they're all good things: honesty, boldness, trust, freedom, team spirit, modesty, fun. But the trouble is, a lot of organisations that say these things, because they're good things to say and they're expected, they don't live them. So I worked at an organisation once, a big organisation, that said, they came out with a new value statement, and one of the big ones on it was, we value teamwork. That's what they said. And you look at the organisation, everyone's sitting in a grey cubicle alone. There are no team rooms. At the end of the year, people got rewarded as individuals. So saying I value teamwork doesn't mean much. They put a foosball table and a table tennis table downstairs so people could, do that in their breaks, and somehow that would build camaraderie or something. So it's easy to say this stuff. It's much harder to live it. But I don't want to knock it, really. But it's better to be striving for this than to be striving for keeping people in check and in the kind of command control environment. There's a little bit more of an idea of that work environments need to be something more than just people coming to work. So this is the language of Teal. Looked at the language of orange, looked at the language of green. This is the language of Teal. It's essentially a blank piece of paper, and it might not even be paper. That's the language of Teal. We don't know it, I don't think. I don't think we know it. We can only draw on what we do know and discover as we go. So when we're trying to say, let's take Agile into Teal, we get the same problem. The more we try to make sense of either with existing language, the more we end up with this. This is like that. Being someone who teaches Scrum, I don't so much anymore, but I used to get people coming, and when you started explaining or talking about the Scrum Master role, they would kind of go, aha, that's like a project manager. Or, aha, that's like a delivery manager. Or, aha, that's like, engineering manager should be doing that. So they have to, they're fitting it into the categories that they know, because sometimes that's all we can do. When you're presented with a new idea, it's so out there that we don't know what to do with it. And we know we need to do something with it, so we fit it into the box that we have. So that'll do. But it isn't. So the question is, how do we talk about self-management, wholeness, and evolutionary purpose? Many of us would have tried talking about these things, especially the first one. I get questions from managers and executives, how do I make my people be self-organized? Don't you love that? How do you make people be self-organized? Or how do I motivate people is another one. The answer to both of those, by the way, is stop doing the opposite. Stop preventing people from self-organizing and stop demotivating people. If you do that as a starting point, you might find that the other parts follow. Human beings in groups are self-organized by default. It's how we live, it's how we survive. We organise ourselves in groups. You only have to walk down Oxford Street on a Christmas shopping day to know that. Considering the number of people there, how things just flow. They're like rivers of people flowing in different directions. People are kind, courteous, they have rules, don't bump into other people. If you're carrying things, keep it close to your chest. These are unspoken rules that everyone follows, and it all works out, it all makes sense. So we don't need a policeman standing there directing the human traffic. People just do it, they just figure it out. So, but we can easily break it, we can easily prevent that happening, and that's a lot of, I think, what happens in organisations. By putting people in positions of power above the people who need to self-organise, we prevent the self-organisation. So how do we talk about that? Self-management, if we let it go, if we allow self-management, it will result in chaos, is very often the response. And yes, it will, absolutely right, unless you have clear vision and clear boundaries. If you don't have clear vision, you don't have clear boundaries, you will get chaos. That's the environment. And wholeness, we don't want wholeness where everyone will bring their personal problems to work. I went to an event one time where they were talking about this, and there was a lot of fear about that. Well, I don't want to be you know, I don't want work to be like therapy. I don't want to have to like reveal my sadness and my loss of my dog or my sickness of my child. And I think it's not about that, of course. Wholeness at work is not about that. It's being who you are and bringing your whole self. You're not bringing your problems to work, but if you are having problems, you might choose to talk about them. But it's not so much about problems or no problems. It's about, where do I come from? Who am I? What experience have I had in the past? Let me bring all of that to bear in my job. So maybe I'm a software developer, but maybe I've been many other things before a software developer. Maybe I've been a teacher, or maybe I've been a carpenter, or maybe I've been a road sweeper, or worked in McDonald's. You know, what can I bring from my past to bear in my current job? That's wholeness at work. That's being exactly who I am and having a sense of pride about it. And the emergent purpose, well, you just talk about that with organisations who have these clear mission statements and vision documents. They don't like it because it undermines the hardness and the solidity of what they have. So what language do we use? What language should we use? And what I mean by that is this. I don't know, but I think that if we can embrace the not knowing, we have a language. We have the language of I don't know. And the language of I don't know is a starting point to discover something new. If we go with the language we've got, we're trying to create a beginner's mind, if you like. If we start with a knowing mind, we're probably not going to get much higher than that, because everything is going to loop back to fit in the compartments that we know. If we let go of all of that and start from scratch, we have a chance of developing a new way of communicating that might take us from where we are to where the promised land, to where we aspire to be. And I think very slow bit of animation. Maybe it's about emergence, right? Maybe something will emerge that perhaps starts to look tealish, teal-like in these organisations, or turquoise-like. We'll see. So the question for you now is exactly this. You leave here, I haven't given you any models, I haven't given you anything to say, oh, I'm going to do what Tobias said in that workshop. That sounds well. I've given you nothing to take away. No patterns, no models, no suggestions. I'm presenting what I feel is the problem, is that we don't know how to talk about this stuff even. And so the question I have for you is what might you do next? And that's it. And I think we have like 5 minutes for challenging questions. You don't have to clap yet. I'm done. I'm not done yet. You might change your mind later. Yeah.
Talking about taking Agile into Teal, but why? If Teal is about not knowing, then maybe Agile's reached its top. Maybe it's Agile that should be forgotten.
Teal isn't about not knowing. Our approach to get there might be to start with accepting there's a lot we don't know, and we need to discover on the way. The reason for doing it is because Agile is inherently rooted in the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto is inherently rooted in software development. So when we're taking Agile into big organizations, people see it quite rightly as a way of working with development departments. They don't see it as something that has to affect the whole organization. But if you're trying to implement change within the way people do their work, you must implement change at the way people receive the work, right? Or the way that requests are made to get the work done. If you don't change that, you just hit the ceiling and it never really changes. And that's why the transformation fails, because again, someone switches out at the higher level, the director level or something, and suddenly there's no support for it, if there ever was. So what Teal offers, I think, what Teal offers is a wider organizational perspective on this. It's not tied down to any particular domain. It's saying any organization can do this. So the organizations he looked at are across a whole spectrum. One of the most interesting ones is a nursing agency, for example. That has nothing to do with building software, but they are a Teal organization. Another one is a tomato growing and packaging plant. Again, so different to what we do. Yet these organizations can and are becoming what he describes as Teal in the way that they work with people. So we struggle with Agile because we're in a way we're crippled perhaps, if you like. We're crippled by the Agile Manifesto, as great as it is and as great as the ideas are. So that's why I think Teal opens up new doors for people who are in the business of changing. Does that help? Sort of.
Goes back to being agile without agile, right? When you're implementing agile, I think all the participants need to understand you can't look at a whole set of instructions and say, okay, this is, you implement this, you become agile. As
Right.
you said, it's all about the mindset of the people within the organization, which is...
It is. It's about being able to like find some way to shift that,
Yeah.
or to help people shift it.
But again, there was someone came out and said it's a generational thing. So as we go ahead, a lot of those people at the top that bring in the kind of managers that want to command and conquer and are afraid to empower their people under them because it might make them look bad or it might make them look good. Or it's a generational thing. I think when you deal with some software developers, I'm a PM, and I started as a software developer, and there are assholes, all over the place you look at. They don't even want to help their fellow developers. Never mind a new mindset and working differently and this and that. They're just tunnel vision. This is what I do. This is how I do it. Everything else is bullshit. You put that person in a position of power, 10 people under them, that's exactly what they're going to get. They're going to get his mentality. Because every time, as a coach, as an agile evangelist, whatever, you go to that person and say, look, guy, you need to change the way you're thinking. You need to change the way you're working with your team. So, sure. But he doesn't channel that down.
Well, he's thinking, no, I don't. Actually, that's what he's thinking, right?
Yeah,
If he's
and
putting
it's
those terms.
insecurities or whatever, or his style of management, or just that's what he feels that is the right way to do it, it won't change. And it could be a generational thing that has.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we've discovered this over the last 10 or 20 years, is evangelizing Agile and trying to convert people is not successful. Really, the only way of making Agile successful is to do it really well in one small part of the organization and create an attraction from it where people see it and say, I want that. I want some of that. And then it will begin to grow from that. But what you've just described there is very much in line with Dave Logan's I'm great, you suck mentality, which is pretty much where we are in the majority of our organizations right now, which is why I felt it was important to map his words onto Laloux's idea, because as I said, it's not completely new. People have looked at this before. And it's a way, the I'm great, you suck is grown, if you look at the two levels below, it's grown from a culture of despair and fear. And when you finally get to a place where you feel like you have some control back, you don't want to let it go, right? Because that's really scary, and that feels like you might slip back to life sucks, or my life sucks, or something like that.
Like the city where we are right now, you work with financial institutions. That's pretty much 90% of the managers in the city are just like that. They're like, I've got the power. Fuck you. You do what I say, not what has supposed to be done. And unfortunately, that's
how it's supposed to be done.
That's what they feel. They think this is how.
What I'm saying is these financial institutions.
But are they? When it comes to IT projects, once you go in, like I worked with Visa Europe, we used to have a third version of a document out, and Visa Europe hadn't even approved the first version, and it's a year and a half down the line.
Are we getting a little bit specific?
Yeah, the point I'm getting to is we're saying they've got to change to Agile, but I think one point is why? What's the guarantee that if they're Agile, they'll be better than they are now? What's the guarantee that if they're Agile, they have...
Well, it depends on how you define Agile, doesn't it? And I think this goes back to, is Agile about just doing, delivering more, doing things faster, or is it something about, and I think this is where the Teal thing overlaps with it, I believe it's something to do with creating more healthy, nurturing, kinder environments where people show up to work with engagement rather than show up to work in complaint. So even though they might be successful, those organizations, if you talk to the individuals, are they enjoying what they do? Are they looking to find a different job somewhere else? I taught a Scrum, 2-day Scrum class in a bank recently, and they'd never heard of Agile or Scrum, almost all of them in the class. It was surprising, but that was the reality. And at the end of it, I always ask people to say, what are you going to do next? And when you leave here, write it down on a card and commit to it. Commit to one small change if you want to take this forward. And I saw one guy's card, and he sort of tried to hide it from me. But on it said, look for another job. So he's opened his eyes to something different. And so clearly that person isn't happy at a bank that is probably really successful by some measure. Although, of course, banks crash too, right, and have crashed.
But
And
maybe you helped him realize that.
I think I did. My job there wasn't to get people to leave the company, of course, but sometimes it's an unintended consequence of introducing new ideas. Yeah, I think we're kind of out of time, if you want to break before the next one. But thank you for the questions. I always appreciate that, and thanks for being here.